Good morning. Welcome to the Lifting Device and Stand Safety Awareness Educational Webinar. You may have noted that I've muted all their microphones except mine, and they will remain muted throughout the duration of the webinar. However, if you do have any questions, please feel free to enter them in the chat box, and at the conclusion of the webinar, I will review all of the questions and email back all of the attendees the questions as well as the answers that came out of today's webinar. So let's get started with the webinar agenda. I'll go through a disclaimer and introduction to lifting device and stand safety awareness, and I'll look at different device and stand types and talk about the different standards. We'll go over a bit of information on wood blocking as well as inspection requirements. I'll touch on load ratings and leave you with some tips for safe usage before reviewing and concluding today's webinar. But to give you a bit of a disclaimer, the webinar was designed to increase awareness on the correct usage of jack stands, jacks, and blocking. So just so that you're aware, the webinar today has nothing to do with cranes, slings or hoists, or aerial work platforms, because those courses are quite readily available from a lot of other vendors. And keep in mind that today's webinar is education only and is not a substitution for site-specific training. And I'm going to kick it off with a completed case study courtesy of the WorkSafe British Columbia. And this will be sent out to all the attendees today. And a worker was replacing front brakes on a semi-truck, and the truck was jacked up and supported by a pair of jack stands, which is correct. But however, while working under the truck, the jack stands failed, causing serious injuries. And as a result of the investigation, it was found that workers were using jack stands that were too light for the weight of the truck. So this is a good reminder to know the weight of the equipment you're lifting and use the correct equipment. Recently, I received this information from the Workers' Compensation Board, and when we're looking at our industry over a 5-year period from 2012 to 2016, there were a total of 93 WCB claims involving the failure of lifting devices and stands. And collectively, when we look at these 93 claims, they drove $165,622 of costs. And this averaged out to just under $1,800 per claim. And we thought it was quite important to give you some of this information that goes with it from the WCB in an effort to help us prevent some of these types of claims from occurring again in the future. Next, I'm going to talk about the different lifting devices and stand types. I just want to make it quite clear that for all of the devices featured in the upcoming slides, you need to know the weight of the item you are lifting, the capacity of the lifting devices, as these devices also need to be engineer approved and capacities markings clearly labeled. And that'll be a continuous theme of the webinar for what I will go over throughout the course of this webinar today. So let's talk about, first of all, the ratcheting jack stand. And jack stands are not meant to lift equipment. Sometimes people think that this is a lifting device, but truly a jack stand is just meant to hold a piece of equipment in place. They provide a safe fixed support for raised equipment. This type of ratcheting jack stand should only be used in smaller equipment, perhaps such as a skid steer or a car. You don't want to use this type of jack stand on a combine. Also, be aware of the handles. If these handles are not properly engaged, or if they're bumped out of position, the jack could drop down to the next lower notch. And with these type of jack stands, they are to only be used in pairs. And with the ratcheting jack stand, you need to be sure that you bend in the tab as shown on the picture on the right. And this stops the Y bar from separating from the frame of the jack stand. It also helps prevent the use of the Y bar in an overextended condition. So for example, you may have the handle resting on the bottom of the Y bar instead of within the teeth of the Y, therefore not effective. And also by bending the tab, it stops users from mixing up different Y support stands, perhaps with a different capacity, or in fact with a different teeth pattern that may not match up to the jack stand frame. So again, just be aware of that and make sure that those tabs are folded in on your jack stands. The next type is a positive pin, and we see these more so in the heavier duty applications, which could be those combines or large pieces of industrial equipment. But a critical fact with this type of jack stand is that you need to use the pin supplied with the jack stand. And you can see on the picture there's a lanyard that holds the pin in place so that it doesn't disappear. Too often I've seen where people have substituted a bolt from their shelf in place of the pin. And that is not effective because these jack stands are only as strong as its weakest link, and you need to use the pin that originally came with that device. There's also the telescoping jack stand, and again these are to be used in pairs, and to use them you remove the pin, lift it to the desired height, replace the pin, and then turn the handle until contact with the item you're trying to hold in place. You want to be sure that you don't use a piece of wood in between this type of jack stand and the load being blocked, as this will point load the wood block and split it. And ensure that you have good base for the jack stand and that it is properly supported on a firm base. And I'll talk a bit about stands. And we see these at facilities fairly often. And there's nothing wrong with using stands. A lot of times they are homemade or built in-house at the shop. And if that's the case, they need to be certified by a professional engineer before they are used. Therefore, having a capacity label tag, such as the picture on the right indicates, permanently marked on that device. So if you are using stands, it's okay to do so as long as they are validated by a professional engineer and the capacity clearly labeled. Talk a little bit about ramps. They are a safe alternative to jacks and jack stands because they provide a large solid point of contact that's unlikely to fail. However, when you're using ramps, just be aware of the maximum capacity and the weight of the item on the ramps, and always be sure to set your emergency brake and chock the wheels when the equipment is on the ramps. Floor jacks. We see these at a lot of facilities that we go to. And when you are procuring or purchasing a floor jack, be sure to choose one that has a very large lifting pad. This will give your jack point plenty of surface area on which to contact. Also to be aware, because a floor jack is on wheels, it's going to want to roll into a sturdy position as the equipment rises. And that's perfectly normal. And once you've elevated your equipment with this floor jack, be sure to lower it onto jack stands before starting any work or going underneath that piece of equipment. And also to remind people, a jack that comes with your vehicle's spare tire changing kit is not suitable for other applications. So if I go to the trunk of my car, pull out the jack that came with it, and try and use it in a different application, it's not going to be effective and could cause failure. So again, just to keep that information in mind. Then we have our bottle type of hydraulic jacks. These are very compact, opposed to the floor jacks, and they're often rated for heavier loads than what floor jacks are. And because bottle jacks usually have a smaller footprint on them than floor jacks, they may not be as stable as what a floor jack would be. Be sure to use your bottle jack on a strong flat surface, such as a shop floor, to minimize the chance of movement. These jacks are basically utilized by putting in the handle into the plunger and pumping it upwards and downwards to raise the hydraulic bottle jack. So that's much the same as this type, which is an air over hydraulic jack. So it's the same system, except it utilizes air power to raise the jack up to the position desired. So again, it's just a spin-off of the same type of bottle jack from the previous slide, except for larger capacities and utilizing air power to raise it. We see these types of devices at shops fairly often, called a floor crane. I used to call it a cherry picker, but everyone may have a different type of name for it. And these two use a longer type of hydraulic bottle jack. But when you're utilizing these, just pay close attention to the outer tube. As your boom extends out of the tube, your capacity decreases. And the further your boom gets out of the tube, your capacity drops. And these need to be clearly labeled so that you are aware of that decrease the further your boom is extended. And again, you also just want to make sure with this type of device that you are using the correct chain and hook, and it has a pin that came in here that was originally designed for this machine. I too have seen where people have stuck bolts in to put the chain in, or they've used a different chain that they may have had laying around the shop. So it's important to use the correct type of chain that goes with this type of floor crane at your facility. Then there are some other specialty lifting devices. You may have come across these, whether it be a transmission jack or an ATV jack. And I know there's other types. We see lawn and garden lifts and various types of jacks, lifting equipments at facilities. But I just want to reiterate that these cannot be home built and that you use them for the intended purpose they were designed for. You don't want to throw a lawnmower on your transmission jack just because it fits into it. You want to utilize the correct piece of equipment for the correct task that is asked of it. Then we also have our high lift jack. Some people may refer to it as a jackhaul or a farm jack. And we see these pretty much everywhere we go. But what I really want to emphasize today is if you do have these types of jacks at your facility, check if it has a label on it that it meets a standard. So it needs to be tested and rated by a standards association. As seen on the picture on the right, this was rated by ANSI, the American National Standard Institute, as well as the ASME. And it talks about its rating and capacity right on the label. So if you are purchasing or utilizing these types of jacks, they need to be in fact approved by a standards association. You also need to know the weight of what you're lifting and lift it straight so that you don't exceed this jack's lifting capacities. You also want to be aware of the base plate. They pivot and a cutter pin usually holds these base plates into place. And some places have disallowed these jacks due to stability concerns. So just to keep that in mind, if you do have them or if you're disallowed them at your facilities, if you are in fact purchasing or looking for them, just be sure that they do meet an applicable standard. Speaking of standards, I'll touch a little bit on the CSA, which is the Canadian Standards Association, identified by the logo on the left. There's ANSI, the American National Standards Institute, identified by the logo on the right. Then there's the ASME, which is the American Society of Mechanical Engineers. And all of these associations, they certify jacks and jack stands. So if you're purchasing different types of jacks or jack stands or lifting devices at your facility, be sure that they meet one of these standards or they are engineer approved. When looking at the Saskatchewan legislation, it indicates that lifting devices need to be of an approved standard, and it does not specify which one, which is perfectly fine as long as it is approved. So as I mentioned before, one of these three standards associations or having an engineer approved will in fact meet the requirements of the Saskatchewan legislation. Think of that jack call I showed you on the last slide. It was approved by ANSI as well as the ASME. Therefore, it's okay to use in Saskatchewan. Even though it doesn't bear the CSA logo on it, it did meet another standards association's requirements. And the flip side to this is, if there's no rating on it and there's no capacities or engineer approval, this is not okay to use at your workplace. And also, don't modify your floor jacks or jack stand devices. I took this picture at a shop here recently, and they added this attachment to their floor jack as seen in the middle picture, and it was home built and it did not meet their any type of engineering approval. And just to give you guys, or folks, another lead, if you are looking for a group to perhaps engineer approve your lifting devices, there's a group in Humboldt called PAMI, the Prairie Agricultural Manufacturing Institute, and they've done a lot of testing and engineer approval of lifting devices. So that is one group that does it, and you can also look to other groups as well that will engineer approve those types of lifting devices. I knew of one farm equipment dealer group that they built their own type of a stand that they've used for jacking sprayer wheels, and they had those approved at PAMI, and as well as now they resell them at their dealerships. So again, just to keep those types of organizations in mind when thinking of standards and knowing that your lifting devices and jack stands do meet an applicable standard. Also, when it comes to wood blocking, there are some standards or best practices, and there's actually a chart. I was really hoping to locate it that indicates a different standard for wood blocking. It speaks to the different types of wood and capacities and sizes. And I looked really hard and I unfortunately wasn't able to locate that chart. But I'm going to continue to look for it. And if I do find it at some point, I will send it out to all the webinar attendees at a later date. Or if you do have it in your archives or records, please send it to me. But I will touch a little bit on some of the wood blocking practices or standards, that these wood blocking devices that you use at your facility need to be made from hardwood. So that you need to use the wood such as Douglas fir or oak, and the wood dimensions need to be at least 4x4 nominally. You can't use 2x4s or 2x2s. Any blocking needs to be at least 4x4 or greater that's used and made from hardwood. You can't use softwood such as pine or spruce or cedar. So just keep that in mind for your wood blocking. And your blocking should be free from rounded edges, any visible rot, cracks, or splitting. A good practice is to store your wood blocking out of the weather elements in a clean, dry place. That will also help preserve your wood blocking. If you have oil-soaked wood blocking, it should be inspected for suitability prior to use. If it's too oily, it's going to be slippery and unsafe. And also, when it comes to slippery, you want to ensure that you don't paint your wood blocks, because that also will make them slippery. And I will have a couple of slides later on coming up about wood block inspection tips, which I will give you as well. So when we look at the different standards for wood blocking, there's also what happens, we could characteristics such as if we point load on our wood blocking, or if we have indentation or bending, or we exceed our blocking requirements from what our wood blocking is capable of withstanding. And these are all characteristics that we need to consider. And the moisture content of the wood blocking plays a major role in how a block carries a load. For example, if you have wood blocking with normal moisture content, the wood blocking will slowly crush and it'll make the odd creaking sound, which is what you are looking for when it comes to blocking. If your wood blocking has been super saturated and it's been sitting out in the rain or moist conditions, when you apply a load to that block, it's going to crush and squeeze out the water, much like a sponge, and your block is going to compress. And the flip side of that is if you have extra dry wood blocking, it's going to crush very little. And it's going to carry a load with little deformation right up until the point of failure. And it doesn't give you any of those creaking noises until all of a sudden it fails. It may splinter or it may all of a sudden fail quite suddenly. So just be aware of extreme wetness and extreme dryness of blocks because they are going to cause different situations to be present that you need to be aware of. Also, I'll touch a little bit on, as I talked about before, storing your blocking indoors. When we have frozen blocking, it's likely to splinter more easily and also be very slippery. So the best practice with that is to bring in that type of blocking indoors into your facility overnight and then use it the next day if you have frozen blocking. And no matter any type of situation, when you are blocking, as you apply the load to your blocking, you want to do it quite slowly. And as you're doing it, be sure to listen for the warning signs that I was telling you about and signs of failure. So we are being aware of the situations where we can see the cracking or splintering or hear the creaking sounds. And people who have used blocks on a regular basis, they've said to me that a wood block will talk if you take the time to listen. So again, listen for those noises because it's going to be indicators of the moisture content of the block as well as the situation so that you're aware that your wood block is going to withstand the load that you've placed on it. So I'll talk a little bit about cribbing for wood blocking. And cribbing, as seen in the picture on the right, is basically a diagram which people use when they are doing different structures where they may have cribbed the blocking as seen. And if you're doing this on soft ground, the platform or base of the crib, it needs to be solid enough to spread out the load. Cribbing will also give you that excellent warning of overload. So if you build your crib properly, as seen on this picture, with the ends or corners overlapped, this will assure a very slow crushing failure if the crib is in fact overloaded, therefore giving you a lot of warning. So if it does fail, it's going to be quite slow. And of course, no failure is the preference, but we do look at cribbing. It does serve the purpose for holding the structure in the needed capacities as indicated on the chart on the left of the slide. But one thing to consider as well that I'll leave you with is limit the overall height of your crib to the 3-to-1 ratio. That's something I want you to retain after this webinar. So basically, if you have a 1-foot base of your crib, you don't want to build that crib higher than 3 feet. So keep that in mind. If we double that to a 2-foot base, we can have a 6-foot height in crib. So just keep that in mind and respect that 3-to-1 ratio. And when you are utilizing it, to be sure that it is done correctly with hardwood as seen on the chart on the right, on the left, as well as the picture on the right. And you also want to never use plastic blocks for cribbing, as they can also be slippery or shatter. I mentioned before some wood blocking inspection requirements. So when you are checking your wood blocking, again, you're just checking for cracks, if there's oil or grease buildup, any nails or screws that are protruding from your blocking. You're checking the type of wood to ensure it is a hardwood. If you're unsure, you can always check with the supervisor to confirm the type of wood that is in fact of the hardwood type for your blocking. Ensuring your blocks aren't stained or painted. And the temperature, if they're froze, if they're over wet or dry. So those are some things, and I know I mentioned them earlier, and I mentioned them again just for the importance of them when it comes to wood blocking inspection requirements. And then I'll talk a bit about the inspection requirements for lifting devices. Ensure that your lifting device is inspected if it's used that day. And sometimes people aren't aware of this requirement. It is legislated in the OHS provincial regulations. So this is basically saying your lifting device only needs inspecting if you are using it that day. And further to that is that you are only using jacks or lifting devices that have been tested, certified, and rated. This inspection for your lifting device, it needs to be done by a competent person, and that inspection needs to be documented and kept record of, that you've checked your lifting device. The operator's manual is a great resource for checklists for lifting devices, and if your lifting device did not come with a checklist, you could also call the original equipment supplier, and they could also point you in the right direction. We have made up different types of checklists for lifting devices, as seen on this slide. And for all the attendees today, I will provide you with a sample inspection templates that you can use, modify, or change to fit the needs at your facility. So you can also make your own type of checklist up to check your lifting devices at your facility. And if you are doing so, just always be sure you're looking for things where you're checking for excessive wear, any cracks or welds, any of that visual damage, if there's any loose or missing parts, and especially for the bottle type jacks, hydraulic jacks, and just to make sure that there are no leaks or oil that is around or built up on the jacks from residue. So that'll give you a few tips for some of those inspection requirements for jacks and lifting devices. I'm going to talk now a little bit about load ratings. And your load ratings need to be clearly legible on your lifting devices and stands. This needs to occur at all times. And again, I snapped this picture at one of our facilities that I inspected, and these floor jacks were not labeled. And I also seen in one facility where they welded and tried to engrave their load rating capacity on the device. And you're not supposed to do that either, because it affects the structural integrity of your jacks if you are engraving or welding into them. So don't do that. And if you're in a situation where your labels have come off of your jacks, such as this picture, you can use your own replacement labels. So if you have a label maker, you can use a label maker to put the labels onto your lifting devices. And in some situations, those stickers just don't like to stick. So I've seen people, they've used laser printed keychains and they've used key rings. And basically by having their own tags and key rings, they're able to get away from those stickers that have came off or those labels that have peeled away. So there is always a way to get those labels onto your devices. You just have to be a little more creative perhaps, because as I said before, sometimes those stickers do peel off. It is your supplier's responsibility to ensure that load ratings are labeled on products they sell. And once you take ownership of those types of products, it's your responsibility to ensure that they remain labeled. As I said before, there are some different tips that you can use to keep those devices labeled at your facility. I'm going to have a few slides here with some lifting device tips. And when I look at this diagram, would you work under this load? I wouldn't either. And as I said, I'll have some different lifting device tips. So if possible, try to park your equipment on flat, stable ground. Again, if your equipment breaks down, you don't really have a choice, I guess, sometimes where it breaks down. But if you do have the availability to park on flat, stable ground, that's always the best practice. And then you're going to want to set the parking brake and chock the wheels. And before you do any type of lifting, you need to know the weight of the equipment. And again, the operator's manual is a great resource for that information. And before you start lifting the equipment, you need to ensure that equipment has been locked out and tagged out before utilizing any stands or blocking. And just on a side note, if you are looking for lockout, tagout information, in the past I have completed a webinar which is on our website, which goes over some of the lockout, tagout practices, as well as some procedures and gives information. So check that out if you need more lockout, tagout information. And again, another device tip would be consult your manufacturer's operation manual. There could be different lifting or blocking points indicated in the manual. Some of the manufacturers have gotten a lot better at that in providing the dealers with those types of information of where I can put my jack or where I can block the piece of equipment. So they are a great resource, the manual, or you can always contact the supplier and they can give you that information as well. But again, before you get under there and start jacking up your equipment, you just want to take a look at your conditions and the surroundings and the task you're doing and conducting a risk assessment and job hazard analysis. And a lot of times people mix up these two components, and the risk assessment basically is looking at risk. Items such as the probability, severity, and frequency of the task, because they want to determine the potential risk of being hurt. And the JHA is different. The job hazard analysis looks at each step in the process and what are the hazards for the steps and how do I control them. And I know a lot of people mix these two components up, risk assessment and job hazard analysis. And again, for more information on that, we do have a webinar which speaks to risk assessment and job hazard analysis. Now that we've taken care of those items, we want to ensure that we have a very firm base before jacking. And always place the jack on that hard level surface capable of supporting the weight of the load. This may require steel plates for weight distribution. And utilizing a flat plate under the jack will ensure that stability, such as seen on this picture. Another lifting device tip is lifting devices are used only to get the equipment off the ground. They should never be used to hold equipment up in place. So once you utilize a jack to lift the equipment up into place, you're supposed to replace that jack with jack stands. And we sometimes see that this step gets overlooked and people leave the equipment sitting on jacks. And you need to get that jack out and have your jack stands holding that equipment into place. Because you're never to go under a piece of equipment that is supported by a jack only. Make sure that it always has suitable safety jack stands in place before you go under any type of equipment. And as you're aware of, when we looked at the first case study from WorkSafe BC at the start of this webinar, we want to ensure that we do not overload a jack or a jack stand beyond its rated capacity. Always use your jack stands in pairs. This helps with the stability, opposed to using just one jack stand and trying to balance it in the middle of the piece of equipment you're lifting. Use those jack stands in pairs. And when you are utilizing wood cribbing, and make sure it's of the appropriate type of wood so that we are using a hardwood and we are recalling that 3-to-1 ratio as mentioned earlier. And after the work is completed with the jacks, be sure to pump the jack just high enough to remove the jack stands. And then be sure that the load is stable before removing the jack completely. So hopefully those tips will give you some indications of safe lifting tips and being aware of blocking and jack stand usage. And as we get close to wrapping up our webinar today, for all of the attendees, I have a safe work procedure on jack stand usage and lifting devices. I've got sample inspection templates, news bulletins on jack stand safety, as well as Toolbox Talk samples, which will be going out to everyone after the webinar concludes. You'll also be able to print off your certificate that you participated in today's webinar and have the opportunity to provide feedback. And in that feedback, we also ask for future topics. Today's topic was suggested to us by a dealer group, and we are always looking for other topics of interest that people are looking for information on at their facilities. And if you enjoyed today's webinar, or perhaps interested in other webinar opportunities, this slide and the next slide coming up, I've highlighted some of the webinars that are on our website for you to review for education purposes. All of these webinars are free and they are on YouTube, and they're usually 45 minutes or less, which make an excellent lunch and learn session. So feel free to go onto our website and YouTube to follow and check out any of these webinars listed. So this brings us to the conclusion of our webinar today on lifting device and stand safety awareness. As mentioned earlier, I'll leave the webinar open for about another minute after I'm finished talking, just to allow people to enter any questions that they might have. If you do not enter any questions but think of something later on, write down our phone number and email address and be sure to give us a call. Something may come up next week or next month as well on this topic. So feel free to call or email us if you have questions about lifting device and stand safety awareness. And at this time, I'd like to thank you for participating in this morning's webinar on lifting device and stand safety awareness. And as mentioned, I will leave the webinar open for another minute to allow the opportunity for questions. And with that, I thank you very much for attending today.